In a previous video, I talked about the necessary components of society to industrialize, and one of them which was labor. Let's talk about labor. Let's talk about the typical worker during the Gilded Age. Uh, it's very important to do so because industrialized labor increases fantastically. In 1860, there's 3 million industrial laborers, right? By 1900, it's 13.5. So as the number of workers increased, so did their problems. Now, one of the biggest problems that the industrialized labor is going to have is the fact that they basically get dependent. They become cogs in the machines themselves. Compare, for example, a person working in a shoemaking factory. Compare that person with a cobbler, okay? And I think you can get my point. A person that's working in a factory loses a sense of independence, or at least individuality. Now, one of the biggest problems that the laborers of the Gilded Age are going to have is the fact that they are going to have bad hours, poor wages, and even worse working conditions, right? They are going to work long hours. A typical work week for a full-time worker today is 40 hours, right? 40 hours a week. And anything above that is going to be overtime. Well, a typical full-time work hours for a full-time worker in the Gilded Age was 50 to 60 hours a week. Some steel workers worked as much as 72 hours a week. Wages were generally low. Remember in my previous video, I talked about how the fact that a standard, the standard salary for an unskilled worker in a Rockefeller refinery was $500 a year. Well, that's pretty much standard across the board. Work is uncertain. When the economy goes up and down, the companies are always going to look for ways to cut costs. And the first way to cut a cost in a company is by firing the workers, reducing your workforce. There's no workers' compensation at all back then as well. And there are working conditions that are just absolutely terrible. They're dangerous. They're absolute downright filthy. There's no protection for the worker. So workers are going to basically be treated as if, well, they're a dime a dozen. Because after all, we have thousands of people coming into the country every single day. A person can get fired one morning, and the next morning his replacement could already be working. And so we are going to have numerous abuses of workers during the Gilded Age. So the question, therefore, is this. What are you workers going to do? Now, they have to basically start to organize. And this is a really difficult thing to do, partly because due to the fact that workers who themselves don't know how to do it. They are going to have to organize, and they can't agree on how to do it. Unions are going to have to be formed to protect workers, and they begin to try to organize during this period. Some workers are skilled workers, and others are unskilled. Skilled workers tend to think that they had more status than unskilled workers. So therefore, they didn't really want to combine unions between the two types of workers, right? So the very earliest unions were on the basis of a common skill. Trade unions, for example, carpenters, typesetters, pipe fitters, right? The first attempt to combine these trade unions into a national union was in 1866 with what's known as the National Labor Union. The other approach was to try to combine anybody who considered themselves a worker into one gigantic union known as an industrial union. And the first attempt to do this was known as the Knights of Labor, and it was done in 1878. Anyone who considered himself a working man could join. Neither attempt had any sort of lasting value or lasting success. Workers held themselves back by internal problems. But the problems were still there, and they had to decide what program to follow. There was at least two possibilities. One was to say, okay, this is a capitalistic system, we're going to work within it. So if you're a working man, what are you going to try to get? Do you try to change the system? No. If you buy into the system, you basically try to get your conditions and your part of the system a little bit better, right? Or you can go the other direction. The other direction is radicalism, is socialism. Who owns the land, the factories, in a socialist system? The workers. Now, workers are not going to agree upon what path to take. They couldn't decide on what was the best approach. There was also problems with the fact that the workers had to face opposition. The public in general was sympathetic to the plight of the worker, but when it came to the strongest weapon the union had, the strike, The public and the government always came down on the management side. They blamed the worker. The public held the unions responsible for the strike. So the bottom line is that it was and still is very hard to organize unions in this country. So having said all of this, of course, crap.